John Ball with CH Training and Coaching. Uh, Myself, as well as my business partner, Lisa Goyette, have been spotlighting building healthy organizations in 2021. And today, as we continue this conversation around creating healthy work environments through coaching, training, assessments, and all of the various dynamics that come into play with creating those healthy organizations, which is so important during these times, especially during the pandemic that we're going through. We have the privilege of having Andy Cripe with us today. He's the chair of Polsinelli Advice and Investigations Practice Group at the national law firm of Polsinelli. He's based in Chicago, and they've been hammered with snow most recent, actually quite a bit. And exactly. And you could probably speak to that a little bit in greater detail, Andy. But he's based in Chicago, and he supports employers across the U.S. and has been actively advising employers on workplace issues through the pandemic. We got to know you, Andy, at the onset of the pandemic as we were brought together through Lockton Companies. And I can't say enough good about you and the work that you're doing, as you're really trying to help employers, businesses navigate these very interesting times that we're going through. And so on behalf of CH Training and Coaching, Lisa and I just appreciate the work that you're doing, the heart that you're bringing to it, and really being a thought leader as we see it in the midst of a conversation that needs to take place that we've been saying for so long that hasn't been occurring. We frequently say that at the very onset of the pandemic, PPE was in place, and you and I have had this conversation on a few different occasions, but physical PPE was being put in place, and rightfully so, for the physical health and safety of the employees of the workforce, but also for the avoidance of legal ramifications. But today's conversation is moving much further beyond just physical PPE. It's the emotional, psychological, social PPE that really needs to be brought into this conversation. And so thanks, Andy, for joining us today. And we're grateful for your leadership as we move through these interesting times.
Thank you. I'm happy to join you.
Yeah. So as we kind of delve into this particular conversation, one of the things that, and I kind of made mention of this in my introduction to you, as well as to the work that we're doing, is that there seems to be a delay in engaging in this conversation that people like ourselves have been having all along about the emotional, psychological, and social health of organizations. And can you maybe just speak a little bit to that on what your sense is on why that's happening, and the nature of the delay and engaging in furthering that dialogue?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And actually, as you were asking it, I was just thinking about, so I started coming back to my office, and I work in a very modern building with a lot of great precautions that were already in place before the pandemic. But when you walk in, there's a big sign talking about all the new precautions, but there's this thing at the bottom, and it says, please be patient with us, and please be patient with our staff. This is the first time we're going through it. And so when I think about your question, that kind of popped into my mind, because I think part of the answer is that, this just blindsided people. Most organizations were not prepared for it. Most people at an individual level certainly weren't prepared for it. And from the very beginning of the pandemic, there was just this sort of, everything is sort of new to us and unexpected, and everything about how we normally operate changed immediately. And that's very unsettling for people. On top of that, a lot of people that you would be looking to in companies to be sort of thought leaders and think about like, how do we respond? They're just inundated. I mean, they're just slammed, right? Just like everybody else. It's increased workloads. You know, the people I'm working with, immediately they had to roll out things they've never done before, social distancing markers and signs and all kinds of crazy things. So just the physical workload of that, on top of which everything is different. And then maybe there's personal stuff, you know, they're teaching their kids it's at home. And so there's just so much, you know. And so I think a big answer to that question is just there's so much on people's plate and people are simply overwhelmed. That's
a really good holistic approach to having this conversation. And so what that is, as I'm reading into and really digesting that part of this conversation, is really what we're seeing is a survival mode mentality that's more reactive than proactive.
Yeah.
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 So go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think people have just been reacting to the latest developments in the pandemic, or reacting to the latest local order saying what you can and can't do. And it's really hard for people to kind of move beyond that survival mode.
Mm-hmm. And yet it still continues to be so baffling to Lisa and I as organizational development specialists, that business leaders who traditionally are on top of their game, in some regards are crippled by, or are being crippled by, furthering this conversation and thinking about the health of their organization in a holistic fashion, as you defined. Yeah. But I think it's important, and we've recognized the same thing, Andy, in terms of the multitude of dynamics that are going into this. So we don't just have, and I don't mean just, but we just don't have a pandemic, but right. We have so many different layers that are on top of it. Yeah, and you mentioned the care of family in and of itself. So we have C-suite executive level leaders who are trying to lead their business, but at the same time, they're trying to provide support to their families in very uncertain times, political unrest, social upheaval. So all of that combined really has created a perfect storm of such. So as you think about, as we have this conversation today, Andy, from your from the seat that you sit, which is a beautiful view behind you, by the way, why is it important to really shift the conversation and start thinking about having this dialogue in terms of the emotional, psychological, and social support of the workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're at a really critical moment where there is an opportunity for people to get beyond that reactive mode. And it's super important that they do that for the health of their organizations, for the health of the people in the organizations. And what I'm talking about is, you know, there's a few things all coming together at once. Yeah. You know, we've got the vaccine rollout happening. We've got pandemic numbers coming down. We've got investors and companies thinking about what comes next and how do we prepare for what comes next. And everything that it has to happen next, whether it's encouraging people to get vaccinated so that they can come back and be healthy, or preparing for an eventual return to in-person work, requires attending to some of the stuff that's built up over the last year now, you know. And you know, that's one of the things. And I think there's a little bit more mental space and just physical space for people to start doing that, because some of those shutdown orders are starting to roll back a little bit. So there's some positive things happening that will enable leaders to focus on these things. And I'll also say, and this is sadly something I have had to deal with a few times, you know, there's been some pretty tragic outcomes in some of what's gone on with employees. And and people are seeing that. And so I think that's been kind of an alarm bell. So, I think this is the moment. If people don't get ahead of that, you start bringing people back to work who are frankly traumatized. They're scared, they're traumatized, and you bring them back unprepared.
Yep.
As an employment lawyer, I think about, what is that going to look like? And I always tell people, your biggest risk when it comes to employment claims, it's not about like technical issues of, did this person do that, this or the other thing. It's really about what motivates people to sue.
Yes.
Not what is a legal cause of action, but what causes people to sue. And it's usually this feeling of just like, it's my last resort. And so it's really important when people are thinking about preparing for that physical return, this emotional and the social and the psychological aspect is just, I think it is the most important thing.
I can't, of course, because of the spheres that you live in and Lisa and I live in terms of the work that we're doing, even though they're different approaches, you from the legal and then us from the consulting and training and coaching piece, is I can't, Lisa and I can't agree anymore on that in terms of really addressing those core issues. So when we're looking at, and you know it better than we do, but we see it in our world as well, is that when it comes to lawsuits and the issues that you defined, is that a lot of it comes down to the perception of a reality that an employee is experiencing and feeling. And so as we think about really avoiding some of those more complex issues on where things could go, and you have shared in the past about some of the horrific things that you've seen, which have been brought on by, and I appreciate the fact that you use the word trauma, and we use the word crisis because that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
It's very objective, or subjective, excuse me, depending on how somebody's seeing the world. But it's important for employers and business professionals to be aware that some of those legal issues can be preemptive by providing care to their workforce in meaningful ways. So I would love to get, of course, we have our own slant on that. I would love to hear your take on some very tangible things that employers can do from what you have seen with your boots on the ground to be able to provide some social, psychological, and emotional health to their workforce.
Yeah, no, happy to. So, I think most of the advice I give around this issue and that I've seen clients sort of focused on has to do with managing expectations, because I think a lot of stress comes from a disconnect between what people are seeing and what they expect.
Excellent.
And so when employers are thinking about how do you set the stage for a healthy return to work, I think the first thing is really being honest and candid and trying to be as thoughtful as possible about setting the expectations for here's what it's going to look like and here's how we're going to handle it. There's a number of really specific things I can touch on. So number one is just timeline wise. And this is something I get a lot of questions about, when can we ask people to, when can we allow people to return? When should we ask people to return? And when can we demand that they return? Right. So if you think about it as like turning up the volume, like how do we turn up that knob? And some employers have moved beyond the when can we force people to return there, and they're saying, we're going to stay flexible forever. And
good.
And more power to them. But there are a lot of companies that, for a lot of reasons, need to get people back to the office. They think it's better, and so setting the expectation that here's what our process is going to look like. There's going to be a period of time where you're allowed to return, where we're encouraging you to return, but being really reasonable and realistic about before they cross that threshold and start saying you must return, and
Yep.
big exception here for really essential workers who probably have been working this whole time. I do a lot of work with companies that frankly, they've not really skipped a beat. They've gone through some really tough stuff, but they've continued operating. So I'm really talking about people that are, trying to bring people back.
Hmm.
And that line, people need to be really careful about saying, we're going to say you have to be back by July 1, because we just don't know right now. And we can talk a little bit more about how you can project what might happen with this virus, but we don't know. We know vaccines will be, now they're saying generally available by July, which means that's still going to be a couple months before you have any substantial level of what they might call herd immunity if everybody, gets vaccinated. So I think the first thing is just setting those expectations about the timeline.
Yep.
Relatedly, kind of in this category of expectations, where I've seen some employers and organizations struggle is where the expectations about what people are supposed to be doing are not clear. There's a lot of people that I think they felt like they were doing what was expected of them if they came in and they interacted with people and everyone could see what was happening. The clients that I've seen that have done relatively well during the pandemic, where everybody went home, were ones that had really clear objective metrics that people had to hit, right? So like lawyers, billable hours, people that sell sales, and people with those more objective targets, I think have fared a little bit better because they haven't struggled to figure out what am I supposed to be doing. The workplaces where and the jobs that are a little bit less objective than that are the ones that I think need the most attention in terms of setting expectations.
So what I'm gathering from this is two things, and if I'm implying something that you're not saying, feel free to correct me, of course, but there's two things that comes into play is first and foremost healthy communication, and secondly authentic care for the workforce, and like truly authentic, meaningful care for the workforce.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. And kind of thinking about some of the more tragic situations I've seen, and they happen. The employers that are able to respond best to those have a track record of those kind of authentic communications before something terrible happens.
Yep.
And so I think that's really important, because if you wait until something terrible happens, until you get an employee suicide or just a tragic health outcome, and then you start talking about this, people will be dismissive of it. And you can spend all the energy in the world then trying to bring in, support for employees and do things to build, but everyone's going to look at it and say, you're just doing that because you don't want to get sued for this thing that happened.
Right. Yep. And what I also hear too, Andy, I appreciate you saying all of that, because the thing that some of the stuff that we've been doing on our end, and this truly does, I mean, in most of the situations that we're working with organizations on and businesses, is an authentic care for their workforce, more so than just trying to save their legal, making sure that they're covered legally, is dealing with crisis and trauma and the grief that has come as a result of the pandemic. And on our end, being able to see employers and businesses and organizations really put some of these things in place, is it attends to the situations and circumstances that you're talking about, is so that it's proactive rather than a reactive approach.
Yeah.
So
no, I agree. And a two-part test I always tell employers, and this was even before the pandemic, that they should use in implementing any decision, is basically the notice and fairness test. Do people have enough notice of something that's happening or going to happen that they'll believe that they're being treated fairly? And then putting aside the notice, just looking at it, does it strike a normal person as fair, right?
Excellent.
And so thinking about how to manage the return, I think that's important. Another aspect of this that's been a challenge is a lot of companies are having to dramatically transform how they do business.
Mm,
And transformation, sometimes it's consultant speak for people losing their jobs.
yeah,
And I certainly am involved in helping to advise clients on that process. And the ones that are really good at it are thinking about that notice and fairness thing, and they're being really upfront about saying our business is transforming. I mean,
yes,
and at this point, everybody knows, like, you know, if you're in hospitality, like, it's a no-brainer. Yeah, there's some massive transformation that's happening there. So the employers that are doing really well are being very open and candid about what they're doing. So people have as much time as possible to adjust in their own life. Maybe they're, if you give that runway, they can either plan how they're going to change paths within or find a path out that's not a harsh landing.
excellent. And on that note too, Andy, you and I talked about this a few weeks ago, is the expectation around where COVID is leading us. And I would like you to just talk a little bit about it, because that was a stimulating part of that dialogue a few weeks back. There's this mentality that exists in the general public and even with organizational leaders around when the vaccine is issued, and when this thing ends. And you spoke very poignantly to that a few weeks back about really changing that conversation and reframing the dialogue around that so that we have some healthier expectations. So can you speak to that?
Yeah. And so, I think, unfortunately, going back to the beginning of the pandemic, we got into this initial mode of, if we do this and we just do this for 2 to 4 weeks, we're done, right?
Right.
And I think that the experience has been, nope. now we got to do it again and again and again. And so when you look at sort of the projections about the pandemic, and it's really, I think, in many ways, a giant math problem. And if you approach it in that perspective, you start getting a more realistic view that, the at the level of transmission we're at, and given how transmissible the thing is, and given the number of people in the world, it is not reasonable to expect that this just goes away. And now that it does seem like finally the public health authorities, even in the last week, are being a little bit more candid about that and saying it's probably going to go from being a pandemic to endemic, meaning it's a permanent feature that may come back. And in the earliest years, it's going to feel a lot like it has felt in terms of in the heart of the pandemic, where, so just looking at the vaccine schedule right now, they're saying that there'll be enough vaccine for the general public by July, right? The vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are 2-shot vaccines spaced out over 3 weeks. And then you don't really get full immunity till you're about a week after that second shot. So even if everybody on July 1 got the shot, you'd be looking at August 1, but everyone's not going to get the shot on July 1 because
Right.
the rollout, and I'm actually involved in this as I'm also an elected official, sort of law is my day job. So dealing with this as a local elected official, just seeing the mechanics, it's going to take months. The vaccine itself is actually challenging to mobilize in the field because of the refrigeration requirements. So
Yep.
really what people need to start thinking about is, we're into, and I think the president said something like this yesterday, by Christmas 2021, it's not that the pandemic ends, it's that we can roll back some of the more onerous public health restrictions.
Yes.
So through 21, you're looking at masks, you're looking at social distancing. Good news, people can go back out to eat and do some things that feel more normal. Travel should start opening up, but things are going to be fundamentally different through 21 and into 2022 as well, right?
Yeah.
And there's some concerns, and I mentioned the importance of dealing with the social, emotional
Yes.
stuff as the vaccine rollout happens. Right now, when you've got people that are traumatized and
Yep.
worried and don't trust what's going on, they're less likely to want to get vaccinated.
Right.
And the real tragedy or the real kind of danger there is we could get too comfortable that the numbers are going down, vaccines are rolling out, and we don't hit the target level of vaccination that we really hope to achieve to get real herd immunity. But we think we did because nobody around you is getting sick anymore. But then we get back into the fall and it's like, oh no, it's like the flu season, only it's this COVID thing, which is not fun. And so then we get another thing next winter. Some of the statistical kind of, and I think the University of Chicago did a really interesting mathematical analysis where they're really saying 3 to 4 years of kind of cyclical surges that could be quite scary. And so I think that's something that employers need to be realistic about in their own planning. And they need to be very careful about feeding a narrative to employees that come back, we're going to have a rockin' party, because that expectation is not going to be met. And it's going to be really sad when it's not met.
Well, you actually had, I think a couple of weeks ago, without divulging confidential information, of course, but you had a client that contacted you that said, hey, advise us on how to manage our welcome back party.
Yeah. And it was more than one client. That's a very common question I get. And the advice I usually give is, you probably don't want to do that. I mean, even if you do kind of successfully pull 100 people into a room and keep them 6 feet apart with masks on, I just don't know what that party is going to feel like.
Exactly. Well, and I think this is where it's a great place to really conclude this conversation, Andy. And this is the stuff clearly that you and Lisa and myself have an inherent bias with these conversations, is because we acknowledge the fact that this is the realm that we are living in as thought leaders and practitioners. But when you're talking about 3 to 4 years out, my mind immediately goes back to where we've already covered in terms of this conversation. It is so crucial, more than ever, for business leaders to really start, if they haven't, to have the conversation around how they're going to position themselves and their companies and their organizations to authentically care for their workforce in those meaningful ways. And so knowing that this isn't a when it's over with type of thing, but the proactive, responsible thing to do is engage in these dialogues with people like yourselves and us as practitioners and thought leaders, to really start asking the question, how are we going to lead in the midst of something that has changed the environment of the workforce potentially forever? So I'm going to, as I post this video, Andy, I'm going to put your contact information in. Again, Andy is from Polsinelli law firm, and he's a phenomenal resource. We've had the privilege to be able to work with him on many different levels, an excellent resource to be able to contact to have this dialogue from the legal aspect. And then, of course, we're more than happy to engage in that conversation with those of you who are watching this video around the practical part of that social emotional piece, which Andy understands as well. And so, Andy, just thank you so much for the work that you're doing through Polsinelli. We appreciate really the authentic vision that you have for caring for your client base, but most importantly, the workforce. So any closing comments that you want to end us on?
Well, I would just say the same thing to you both, that, the work that you do, I think it's an area that employers have not spent a lot of time thinking about because they have not had to as much. Right. I think it's so fundamental to the success of companies going forward to really be thinking deeply, to really put it on the level of, here's our company health plan, what's our social, emotional, psychological health plan, because there's some big challenges and how, not just being in that reactive mode. So, thank you
Excellent.
for the work you're doing. And, I would really encourage employers to reach out and just talk to you guys and say, how can I start incorporating, a healthier approach into what I'm doing and get some coaching on that.
Well, we're all in this together. We don't see ourselves as silos in this conversation. And Lisa and I are just grateful for the fact that the conversation's now actually taking place. So thanks again to you and your firm. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue as we move forward.
Thank you.
Andrew Cripe from Polsinelli and John Ball and Lisa Goyette from CH Training and Coaching.